Okay, what's up, people of the universe? This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and I am very happy to be with you to celebrate this momentous episode, the 100th episode of Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. And it's funny, 2.5 years ago, when we started this podcast, my producer and I, we had a little bit of an argument, not really, but a disagreement about episode numbers. I maintained that all the podcasts list the episode numbers in the title, and we should do the same. And he felt like they weren't necessary, that it's an asynchronistic universe, and why are we trying to number them and synchronize them? And, ultimately I relented. I didn't care that much. And as the years have gone on, I kind of like that the episode numbers aren't there, because I don't really want to feel like I'm keeping score. If I wanted to, I could have taken the advice of a number of people who told me that the episodes were too long. I could have cut them in half and had part ones and part twos, and I'd be on my 200th episode now, So it's never been about how many episodes I have. But I have to admit, having reached the 100 episode mark, it feels like a milestone. It feels like I've been working hard for a while to crank these out every week, And we've hit the 3-digit mark. So that feels good. I want to own that. I really do enjoy making these podcasts and sharing them. I've been profoundly grateful to those of you who've been listening, especially those of you who've been with me since the beginning. Because, it was a little rocky there at the start. And I've been working on it. I think it's improved over time. I am really enjoying the process of doing it every week. I feel like I continue to learn and grow and meet new people from doing it. I have been surprised and overjoyed by the kind of connections that are happening between those of you who are listening and this podcast. It's been incredible, and it's really, truly a rewarding and profound privilege to come to you every week like this, and that people are listening to it and engaging in it, and it's spurring other conversations. And just thank you to everybody for making it what it is. And I will most certainly be continuing on. So let me set up today's talk with Richard Freeman, because it is a momentous talk to go with this momentous occasion. I've often mentioned that I started out with a list of people that I wanted to talk to. And Richard Freeman was the first person on that list. If you don't know who he is, and I'm surprised that there would be some people who don't know who he is, but I got to be honest, recently I was talking to a podcast listener, and I couldn't hold my tongue, and I wanted to tell them who the 100th episode was, and I said, it's Richard Freeman. And I could see from the look in their eye, they're like, oh, cool, but I could tell that they didn't know who Richard Freeman was. And I was really surprised and felt really old. But if you came into yoga at a certain period of time, like in the 90s, especially like when I did, you know who Richard Freeman is. I really feel like he was one of the main bridges of like these Eastern teachers and the gurus and yoga coming into the West. He was one of the main proponents. He's been talked about on this podcast before. Diane Bruni talked about learning Ashtanga from his video. And just for myself personally, he was sort of an example of somebody who was a real yoga practitioner. And I know that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in my experience, he was someone who really walked his talk, and he was sort of operating on another vibratory plane, which you can hear. I mean, you know, I tried for a long time to get Richard on the podcast. I sent out a blind email through his website a long time ago, years ago, and I got no response. And then when Kachi Ananda came on the podcast, who was one of my teachers, who is friendly with Richard, I said, is there any way that you could help me get Richard on the podcast? And she gave me like another email address, and I think sent him an email putting in a good word for me. And then I sent an email to sort of say, hey, but I never heard back. And then I think I tried again out of nowhere more recently when some of this stuff was going on and Mary Taylor had put her blog out, and I kind of reached out, and then they got back to me, and then it was like, oh, he's free to do it on Tuesday. So it's like I'm trying to get him on for like years, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, 3 days from now, you're going to talk to Richard Freeman. So I think I was definitely a little bit like, oh my God, like it's actually happening, you know, the number one on the list for the podcast. And, you know, not only that, you'll hear Richard, it took us a little while, I think, to get used to each other. And he has a certain cadence and a certain sense of humor. And you know, I was sort of like, oh my God, oh my God. So to sort of just kind of relax and just listen, he really challenged me. And ultimately, I'm pretty happy with the way it went. It's funny, though, when we finally did settle in and things I felt were really starting to like, oh, like the conversation was happening, we started to have like technical problems. The call actually dropped out twice. And that never happens. That never happens. Fortunately, we were able to pick up the conversation both times, and the edit's clean. You might not even, you probably won't even notice when it happened. But for me, it was just sort of ironic, you know, after all this time. But the great thing is, I really did feel like I got to know Richard Freeman a little bit in this talk, and certainly got a glimpse into what it was like to come into yoga in the generations before mine, you know, and then to sort of see how that is in comparison to what the landscape is now. Let me also mention that this was recorded a little while back, like over a month ago, maybe even like 6 weeks. I've been sitting on it. If you've been listening, you know, I've been mentioning it. So there's a bunch of things that have happened in the Ashtanga community since we talked that we don't talk about in this. We do talk about the recent discussions and situation with Pattabhi Jois. We do eventually get there, and we do talk about that some, but again, it was a while back, and it was at a very early time when just a few things had started to come out, and things have evolved since then, so we don't really cover it all, but we do go there some, and I just feel like I should mention that for those of you who are really up to date on what's happening in the Ashtanga community, just to know that this was recorded like 6 weeks ago, so it's not totally up to date. But you're going to hear it's an amazing talk, and it's the 100th episode with Richard Freeman, which you're going to get to listen to today. But first, let me drop my stuff really quick. I'm going to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, February 16th through 18th. I've got a 2-weekend-long intensive in Easton, Pennsylvania, March 2nd through 4th and 9th through 11th. I'm going to be in Japan, March 16th through 25th. I'm going to be in East Hartford, Connecticut, April 8th. I'm going to be in Fishkill, New York, April 14th. And I'm going to be in Falls Church, Virginia, April 27th through 29th. You can find out about all those gigs and more. You can listen to the archives of this podcast. You can read my blog or find my online yoga video offerings. All that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Please, if you've been listening to the podcast and you're enjoying it and you're getting stuff from it, you might make a gesture of support and go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation, or go to Apple Podcasts and iTunes and write a review and give us a star rating. That stuff really helps. We're very appreciative when you do it. Okay, I am going to touch base with you on the other side and kind of like, debrief after this talk with Richard, and maybe just, talk a little bit about what's happening going forward. But I think I've already kept us from it for long enough. Let's go ahead and listen to this talk I had with Richard Freeman.
Hello.
Hello. Is this Richard?
It is Richard. This is Jay.
This is Jay. Hi, Richard.
How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot out there to consider. Yeah.
There often is a lot to consider, sometimes even more than others, but today it seems like there would be a lot to consider.
Yeah.
And one of those things is that I'm getting a chance to speak to you.
Oh, well, I hope you're not disappointed.
No. I mean,
the content.
No, I don't see how I could be. You know, when I started this podcast, 2.5 years ago, I started it because I was reflecting on how I started teaching and practicing yoga in my early 20s in like the 90s. And now I was like in my 40s and I have 2 kids. And in that time, like yoga went from this underground thing to this mainstream thing. And I rode that wave.
Yes.
And I was just sort of trying to like suss out in my mind, like coming into my adulthood along with like yoga having that progression. And I made a list of people. It was not a very long list. It was like 25 people maybe that I thought, these are the people I would want to talk to about this.
Yes.
And your name was right at the top of that list. And so it's like a really wonderful moment for me that I actually have you on the line and I'm talking to you right now. And I think I want to say one other thing is that I know a lot of people who are listening to this podcast are like me in that if you started coming into yoga at a certain time, especially in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of sources. And
yes.
And like the gurus weren't necessarily accessible to me. One, just for like proximity, and one just in terms of what I could relate to. But the Western students of those gurus were where I was able to get kind of access to those teachings.
Of course, yeah. Someone had to, in a sense, translate.
Yeah. And Diane Bruni was on this podcast, for instance, and she said she learned Ashtanga from your video. And so for me, you're one of those people who is like the bridge between those gurus and then it coming to the West.
Uh-huh. Yeah, still coming. You know, it's coming to the West and then it's going back to the East. It's kind of a back and forth thing.
Huh.
And it gradually evolving on both sides, I think.
It certainly has taken an evolution in my lifetime. But I'm also curious because to me, like, I'm interested in when it first starts to happen. And I just had Barbara Benning on the podcast, and she talked about going to her first yoga class in like 1968 and then actually leaving the country because of what was going on with the politics of the country. And like having her studies happen outside of America. And I was looking at your bio and it seemed like a kind of similar thing happened to you. Like you started doing yoga right around that time as well. Isn't that right?
Right, in 1968, which is past lifetime.
Well,
I couldn't be that old, so it must have been a past lifetime. Yeah.
well, how do
and that was in college, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so in college, how do you find yoga in 1968? Is it like a concert? Is it a class? Is it, like, how do you...
Oh, well, I read about yoga, and it was mostly from reading that I started practicing. From the few books that were out there at the time. And then in 68, I went to, I was going to college near Chicago, and I went to Chicago, and there's the Chicago Zen Center or Zen Temple, which was run by a sweet old Roshi from Japan. And he was the first real yogi that I met. And at the Zen Center, they only taught one yoga pose, but they did a good job of that pose. And so that was, very influential for me. And of course, at the time, I was interested in, multiplicity of yoga postures, as well as meditation. And so basically I learned from books, and I had in retrospect, the audacity to teach a couple of yoga classes in college. But we were all, inspired by what was going on in the late 60s. And so...
Well, it seems to me that before, there were DVDs, there was these books, and Richard Hittleman's book always comes up on the podcast.
Yeah.
There was a couple of books you could get where people were using to kind of go off of.
Yeah.
And so this Zen temple that you went to, was it one of those ones where they would hit you with the stick?
Yeah, exactly.
They taught you to sit, right? With the stick.
Yeah, you would sit, and then when you were first being trained, they would tap you on the shoulder before they would hit you. And it would just make a loud kind of snapping sound, and if you were dozing off, it was a good shock. And then with some practice, then they would just kind of hit you from, it seemed randomly, and but it wouldn't really upset your concentration because you were sitting quite straight and minding the breath in your belly or something like that. And in today's world of, overly quick interpretation, you would say, oh, they were being so abusive. What an abusive tradition that is.
From the outside, it might appear that way, yeah.
Yeah, it might appear that way, but it wasn't at all. And so it was a very profound thing. And of course, at that time, I was, very eclectic in my seeking. So I was seeking in all directions. And I didn't, and in a sense, I still am. I'm a very eclectic practitioner, even though I've focused on a few particular traditions, because I still look out, into the broad spectrum of all these different traditions and different cultures for clarity.
Well, I had one friend of mine who...
But you have to focus on something,
Yes.
So it's better to focus on what actually is nearby and you have available to you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I had a friend of mine who studied in the Zen tradition, and I asked him specifically about getting hit with the stick, and he said that he actually thought it felt good.
Oh yeah,
that he didn't feel like it was abusive at all.
Not at all. No, just like it's almost like hitting a bell or something. It's just like, whoa, where was I? And it snaps you back into immediate sensation. Kind of exposes the mind for how silly it is. And so it's a very good technique, and it's, to my knowledge, it's uniquely part of the Soto Zen tradition.
Right. But you said you were studying lots of different traditions, right? Not just Zen.
Well, whatever I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
And so I was fascinated by anything that would address that kind of mystical experience that was people were just becoming interested in.
Right. And that did take you out of America, right? You went to Asia to study, I read in your bio.
Yeah.
And so how old were you when you did that? Did you finish college or did you take off before you were done?
No, I dropped out of college to pursue my meditation and spiritual studies. And that was, I dropped out in 1970. And many people were under the belief that the spiritual revolution was so strong that, and of course the Vietnam War was still going on, that college was becoming quite irrelevant, except as a draft deferment technique to the deeper reality. And of course that was just my particular angle on it, my particular circumstances. I would, if I could go back in time, I could counsel myself and say, well, there's actually more out there, Richard, than you see. And so I was quite inspired to move on, to trace the real thing.
And so you decided to go to India first? Where did you go first?
Well, actually, in 1970, I became a Hare Krishna devotee.
Here in the West?
In the West. And this was actually just before the time that they, in my opinion, became obnoxious. And, when I started it, Allen Ginsberg was into it, and, it was kind of quite a unique phenomenon. And basically people were chanting, and it had the appearance of being a very universal or non-fundamentalist approach to bhakti, using, the mythology of Krishna. But later it became more cult-like, where it was more literal, and, our approach is better than anyone else's approach. And that was, just the devolution of, I think, the original group. And so I took off to India, in a sense rejecting that, and I took off to India to find more of the roots of it. And that was quite an adventure.
Yeah, I've heard getting to India back then was a whole thing. You had to go and kind of go over the pass, like you couldn't just fly direct like nowadays. Like you had to do
I actually got a flight to Zurich, and then from Zurich there was another flight. And I naively at the time had only $13, and I didn't have a visa, which... But that was just the beginning of the adventure, because I was into, becoming a monk, being a mendicant, and that gave me a nice insight into kind of traditional Indian culture, because I was well taken care of.
What do you mean by that? Like if you went to India in 1970 and went as a spiritual seeker, you could people just have like an alms bowl and people would, or did you go into like an order? Like, how does that happen?
Oh, I went to the, people who were related to the Krishna movement, either directly, or there was a whole, background of Indian teachers and other ashram who were, cousins related to it. Mm-hmm. So it was an actual tradition. Mm-hmm. And I showed up and I met the assistant police commissioner of Bombay about a day or two after I arrived, and he said, "Oh, I can help you with your visa," because I had a 21-day landing permit. And he took me to meet his guru, and then we filled out paperwork, and from then on I went to many places all over India and became a traveling swami and visiting different ashrams and temples, but I always carried the paperwork with me for the visa. And then after over a year, I had gotten, as one might predict, some distress in my gastrointestinal system trying to go native in India. And so I decided to leave overland to Europe. And that was quite possible at the time. And so I went to get the stamp on my passport that I could leave in New Delhi. And they said, we could throw you in jail for not having a visa. But I had all the stacks of paperwork. And the man said, well, you could... I was the guy was actually being friendly because he saw I was deeply interested in, what the best parts of Indian culture, at least in his opinion. And he said, if you come back tomorrow with a ticket out, I'll give you the stamp. So I got a bus ticket to Lahore, Pakistan, and he gave me the stamp. And so I did an overland trip through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and wound up in Greece, and then spent, a few months in Europe, and then went back over to India, and got kind of a nice introduction to how to travel, on a small budget, across the Middle East and in Europe at the time. And in retrospect, I was, but a young boy at the time, in my early 20s, and still kind of gobbling up and questioning and, doing my forms of practice. I was, still passionately interested in Hatha Yoga, but its relationship then to Bhakti and then to Jnana Yoga and all of the other practices.
And when you're taking off and going to India and doing all this, what do your folks think?
Oh, my poor parents. I have to, I have to remember them in my thoughts. They were so, I'm sure they were so worried, because it was very difficult to communicate in those days, because there was no internet, and basically you had to write aerograms. And so I can't say it was every month, but every month or two, I would send them an aerogram from different parts of the world, saying, I'm fine.
I'm still alive.
But that was the attitude that, there was a huge generational divide at that time. And they, I'm sure, were just so sad that, I was, this young person wasting my life. I had such opportunities to do other things and such talents, and I was wasting my life in this pursuit of, the strangeness of Asian cultures and contemplative cultures. And later I made up with, we reunited some years later.
And what do you think it was in you that made you feel so determined to make that you would make it your life direction in such a full way like you did? I'm sure there's a lot of people in the 60s who were kind of interested in Eastern ideas, but you made your life exploring it. So do you know where did that come from for you inside you? Where do you think that decision comes from?
Well, that's hard to say where it comes from, but it was certainly almost an electrifying excitement that really happened to me in late high school and early college, which, of course, some of this was induced by some of the things that people were doing in the late 60s. Mm-hmm. But my interest preceded that. in that I was interested in philosophy from an early age, maybe starting around the age of 12. I started reading a lot of Western thought. One person who influenced me very deeply was Thoreau, and then the American Transcendentalist school of Emerson and Whitman. And they were actually interpreters of particularly Indian philosophy, and one of the first group to interpret it in the Western world in the 1840s. And I really connected to that. And I don't know, there's just a kind of attraction. And I didn't feel alone. I felt that most of, there were many, many people in that time who were equally inspired and interested, and they were pursuing, different threads into different traditions and different combinations of traditions. And I still feel that today. When I go around the world, I find people in all different countries, from different cultures who, they have they have a smile and a little light in their eye where they've tasted a little bit of reality, and then they start, just pursuing it through however it presents itself to them. And so,
as a sparkle in their eye, yeah, like that.
Now, somehow, this experience happens, and our mind, of course, then looks for a mechanical technique or a particular way that it can solidify it so that our ego can grab onto it and we can then control it, reproduce it, and make a good livelihood off of it. And I think it's a little more slippery than that.
It's interesting. Well, I think of something I always remember Krishnamurti said about having a skillful means, having something to hang on to. And I'm wondering. Go ahead.
Oh, then we find that the way to really connect to it is really to kind of whatever formula you've made. You've created a kind of sacred, holy formula, even like a temple or a particular, group of words or some explanation. And the way to really connect is to let go of it, to see that that's nice, but that it's impermanent. It really doesn't have anything permanent, and to offer it and say, here you go. And then you come back into this more delightful state of really not knowing, but somehow in a different sense knowing, in which you really feel connected to, not only all different approaches to yoga or mysticism, but also you feel connected to all species and living things. But you have to make that sacrifice where you let go of it. It doesn't mean it's wrong or right. It just means that your ego is clinging on and, trying to spoil the whole thing for yourself and then for everybody else. So I'm kind of a fan of, I'm not a fan of eclecticism, but I'm a fan of communication, across boundaries between, people who are really sincerely looking and who want to be honest about what they know and how they know it, and want to keep looking. So,
well, I think that's very interesting, especially because, you're associated with Ashtanga Vinyasa, but I also know that you also practiced with Mr. Iyengar prior to that.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm curious. I'm back where we were in India, and you're coming back from your your trip back, you're out, you went to Europe, and then you came back. When do you meet Mr. Iyengar?
Oh, that's a long... What happened then is, after I went back to India, then I was basically a traveling monk, and I took from traveling to different temples in India and being their guest, which is actually not that hard once you know a little of the language and the system. I then did that same thing up through Thailand and down through Malaysia to Hindu temples and communities, and then, which was just an incredible experience because, I think mostly because I was a foreigner and I was so young and probably in people's eyes quite innocent, though I thought I was quite the thing. And I came back to India and I met a fellow from Iran, and he thought because of my kind of, it's not I don't know what I don't like the word eclectic approach, but let's say broad approach. He invited me to come to Iran to teach yoga. And so I told him, actually I had been through Iran on bus once and I wasn't, excited by it. But I told him I'd check it out for a month with him. And so I went with him and I spent 4 years there, basically teaching yoga in an Islamic context, in this most marvelous of ancient cultures, which is Persian culture. And it was there in Tehran that I met my first Iyengar teacher, and that is, at the same time, that's when Mr. Iyengar came out with Light on Yoga. And so that was my exposure, 1974 through 1978. And then after that...
what was Iran like at that time when you were there, that 4 years? I think of Iran now as like this, I don't know, you hear things about it in the news, and I'm just curious, what was it like at that time when you were teaching there?
Oh, what was... So in Iran, at that time, Iran was the place in the Middle East for, I would say, cultural synthesis, which is something that liberals might really appreciate and conservatives fear. And so it was, doing quite well economically. It was, there were a lot of interesting intellectuals from the West coming to teach there at the university. And I was, of course, exposed to Sufism and to, those practices there. And so for me, it was really, a big part of my education. And then, of course, and very quickly in the 1978, the Islamic, what was then the Marxist, which Marxism had been repressed due to the influence of CIA. And so in the universities, the students were all interested in Marxism because they weren't allowed to explore it. And the secret police, were abusive. And so that was a huge problem, internally in Iran. And then out of, deep in the background, the Islamic revolution started to come from. It was very deep anti-Western fundamentalism, personified by Ayatollah Khomeini. And so the revolution quickly appeared, and I was right there, and so I got to experience a couple of months of the fighting of the revolution, and then I left for my own preservation in late 1978. And then back to, and so, eventually I met Mr. Iyengar, and so I have been, in a sense, and I like to joke about this, because I don't see in actual practices that, the Ashtanga Vinyasa approach and Mr. Iyengar are opposed to each other, but I think they're deeply complementary to each other. And so I always joke that I teach Ashtangar yoga, but because people don't really explore either system that deeply, they think there's total conflict between them.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.